Hi, everyone. My name is Chad Evans, the Executive Vice President of the Council on Competitiveness. And I'm really excited to be here today with an incredible leadership group, really all of whom are working at the cutting edge of innovation, spanning imagination, insight, ingenuity, invention, and ultimately impact. Now, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'd quickly like to introduce our panel. We have Tammy Irwin, the Executive Vice President of Verizon and the Group CEO at Verizon Business. Jamie Hyndman, Chief Technology Officer, John Deere. Steve Isakowitz, the President and CEO of the Aerospace Corporation. Tom Mason, the Laboratory Director at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Ed Seidel, the President of the University of Wyoming. And Wendy Winterstein, the President of Iowa State University. First of all, I just want to thank you on behalf of the Council on Competitiveness for being with us. Let's dive in. I look back at the data. 1964. That was the year in which federal support for research and development, really the foundation for our nation's innovation capacity, our seed corn, it hit an all-time high, 1.8% of GDP, just under 2%. Today, that figure is barely 0.6% of GDP. So somehow, over the last half century, our nation's intensity in investing in research and development infrastructure to develop and deploy at scale disruptive technology has been on the decline. And at the same time, that intensity is growing all around the world. Now, that doesn't mean we don't see disruptive technology emerging in the United States today. On the contrary. But it does make one wonder what has been the opportunity cost over the past 50 years. So Jamie, I'm wondering if you don't mind if I could turn to you first. Your opportunity, what gets you excited as the CTO of John Deere? What do you see on the horizon or on the farm fields of today that you think will disrupt our nation's innovation potential? Be that next inflection point. Yes, in agriculture, but perhaps even more broadly than that. And then Tammy, just to foreshadow, I'd love to ask you the same question from Verizon, tagging on to Jamie.
Yeah, Chad, thanks for the question. I think it's actually a combination of technologies that gets me excited. If I think about, current state and what's ahead of us within our industry, it's really the combination of increasing capacity and bandwidth and speed and connectivity, connecting in our industry machines to machines and machines to cloud and machines to growers in the agricultural environment. That's one piece of the puzzle for us. Another one would be advancements that are happening in compute, our ability to take the information that flows through that connectivity network and do useful things with it, both on board as well as off board, both with conventional compute as well as some new things on the horizon, quantum computing as an example in the future. And then the third leg of that stool for me are advanced algorithms. We talk about that in the context of artificial intelligence frequently, but the ability to drive intellect into products that make the sustainability and productivity of people that are using those products higher and better. Those are the things that I think are coming together in our industry and in multiple industries to sort of create opportunity that's greater than any one of the individual parts. Tammy?
Yeah, so Jamie, you hit two of the three C's I would have hit: connectivity, compute, and I would add cloud. As we think about really all of those coming together, and from a Verizon standpoint, when I think about what we're really excited about, if 2020 has shown us anything, it's that connectivity is so important to how we live our lives. I think about small businesses, more than 50% of small businesses, when their physical doors shut with COVID, their entire business shut because they did not have a digital front door. So you think about the interconnect between cloud, between compute, and then really connectivity and things that people can do with AI capability. Jamie, to your point, for Verizon, we have really led the world in the deployment of 5G capability, and we think this is a game changer. 5G UWB is radically different than 4G. You think about the evolution of 3G to 4G to 5G, and you think about faster data speeds. Yeah. 5G UWB is much more than that, and we've now launched 60 cities. So when you think about scalability to kind of a broad American base, that is certainly what we've been focused on, because it provides the 8 currencies and capability for people to really drive innovation to continue to compete in a world where you've got cloud, compute, and connectivity coming together. So we just think it is driving the 4th industrial revolution. We have led the world to developing that ecosystem, not only here in the US, but in things like the 5G Future Forum. I would just add one other thing that I think is so important, and that is, as we think about what we do around access, around affordability, and application, I think we'll get into that conversation today, because we think it's more than just providing the network. It's about making sure we participate in things like Citizen Verizon, where we help bridge that digital inclusion.
Tammy, thanks for raising that. You know, Deborah and Mahmood, our chairman and CEO of the council, they both released early in their day our new Competing in the Next Economy report, which is the culmination of a year's worth of work for our National Commission. And one of the major recommendations is really calling for a new digital access and innovation initiative to meet exactly your point, that I think what we've all learned is that without that backbone, there is no innovation potential in the future. And so I appreciate you raising that. And I think it also links back to maybe a point, Jamie, and I know Ed and some others will bring this up as well, I hope, is engaging more than this, just the West and the East Coast of our innovation economy, is creating that really integrated fabric where everyone has the potential, if they can access it and afford it, to really be innovative. Ed, Wendy, maybe I can turn to you and then to Steve. As you heard Jamie and Tammy speak and talk about sort of the bleeding edge of technology and where they see real potential for innovation inflection coming from innovation disruption, people are going to be at the heart of that. And as you're leading major organizations with large number of students, but in Aerospace Corporations, a large number of employees who are really innovating at the edge, you know, what matters to you? How are you thinking about deploying this massive resource to ensure the U.S. has long-term productivity and prosperity? Ed, maybe you want to hop in first, and then we'll go to Wendy.
Thanks, Chad. So as some of you know, I've just recently moved from Illinois, where we have so many assets, or I had so many assets from the state of Illinois, including national labs, the city of Chicago, amazing universities. We thought somehow that wasn't enough, so we needed to create networks that link together all of the state's higher education. So we created a thing called the Illinois Innovation Network that included universities across the entire state. In fact, basically all of higher ed, including the private universities. So now I've moved to Wyoming, where we're in a very different situation. We don't have those big assets. In fact, for contrast, we're about the size of the United Kingdom, but we have half the population of Rhode Island scattered about. And so this is a very different environment. So we have to think very differently about how we're able to harness the talent assets and then to network them. And the technologies we just heard about are going to be essential in doing that. So the same idea, though, I think applies here in terms of creating a network. We have to think about ways to pull together the talent, and it's in a different ecosystem. So in the state of Wyoming, we have one university and we have 7 community colleges. And it's also a different culture where kids that are growing up here, no matter how talented they are, they're typically thinking about staying locally, perhaps going to a community college or to the University of Wyoming. And so we have an enormous reservoir of talent that we have to then harness in a different way. So then we think about how do we pull them all together, how do we train and retain the talent to the state of Wyoming or to the other rural areas. And again, thinking about the network effect, we're talking a lot with other states, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and so on, which are similarly very rural. But collectively, we have a lot of talent, and we have then our assets that we can bring together through networks. And how we're thinking very much about how to pull them together to create regional hubs of innovation around the different educational centers, but then to network them so that they're stronger than ever, because any individual one probably alone doesn't have the critical mass. So we're trying to find ways to create that critical mass and then harness our assets. So we are talking again to national laboratories. For example, within this region, we have Idaho National Lab. We have NCAR Wyoming, a supercomputing center supported by the NSF. We're also thinking about how do we network outside the region, both with other national labs. We've just submitted a proposal actually to the NSF for an AI center that involves Argonne, Oak Ridge, Brookhaven National Lab, and a number of universities. So we're trying to find ways to connect in, even internationally, to think about doing programs, for example, around software engineering. So we're trying to align the assets, particularly around higher ed, including the community colleges, to create, for example, a statewide software engineering program, but with help from outside groups and so on. So there are a couple of key advantages I see to this. One is the smallness of the government systems, for example, and the educational systems make it easier to align. We had 12 public universities in the state of Illinois. There's one in the state of Wyoming, so even a single university is not easy to align, but it's easier. There are fewer moving parts, so that's number one. Number two, the government organizations are smaller. We have access to the legislature and to our federal delegations and to the governor at a level that you don't have in larger states. So we can be more nimble. So for example, the state of Wyoming has a lot of advanced blockchain legislation to try to position it because it's able to move quickly, and other states as well. So the final thing I'll say about the advantages of the rural areas is people here have exactly what's needed for entrepreneurship and innovation. They have grit and determination. Life historically has been very hard here. There's a lot of adversity, and they think differently about things, which is another incredible aspect for innovation. So put it all together, it's not just about affirmative action. We have to be involved in the innovation, but we have a lot to contribute to it, and there are a lot of new ways of doing business here.
Thanks, Ed. You know, as you were talking, it made me think of Star Alliance. You know, you're pulling together all these partners to really make something, you know, the whole bigger than its constituent parts. And Wendy, I wonder if you could jump in and share your perspectives from Iowa State. And I want to flag something that Ed, you raised. I want to come back to Jamie and Tammy in a moment, and obviously Tom and Steve as well, is this idea about regional hubs for innovation. So keep that in the back of your mind, folks, because I want to come back to that, because that's a critical infrastructure for national innovation in the U.S. But Wendy, please.
Certainly. Well, first of all, I just want to say congratulations on the new report, Competing in the Next Economy. I think some of the recommendations in the report are just going to be critical for the future. And at Iowa State, we've often, and for a long time, been seen as a leader in innovation and entrepreneurship by our faculty and staff. But what we've seen as a critical need is to really open up that opportunity to our students, so that undergraduates can come together, can see what it means to be involved in research that leads to a patent, that leads to a new business. And we're doing this in a new Student Innovation Center, 140,000 square foot building that brings students from every major in the university together to think about how they create and innovate. So having young people see the opportunity while they're at the university to learn what it means to innovate, I think, is how we build the next generation of inventors, for example. It also steps back a little ways before those students get to Iowa State, and we think about what we do in K through 12 and the opportunities to help students understand that they too can become an inventor. So whether it's something like Invent 4-H, or it's the governor's STEM councils on what it means to be involved in STEM as a career and what that might mean from an innovation standpoint, I think that's critically important in building the pipeline. And then, Chad, I would finish up on that point by simply saying that everybody must be given the opportunity to come to the table. Your last session on building America's team is critically important. Diversity is key. If we don't have women, if we don't have diversity in terms of race, ability, disability, all issues related to diversity, then we won't have the best ideas to be able to compete and to innovate. Finally, one of the recommendations in the report that I really like, Chad, is how we think about promotion and tenure differently at universities. And I think it's time to recognize and show that individuals who are inventing really need to be recognized in that process. So we could go on and talk about those recommendations in detail, but those would be a few thoughts from a Iowa State University perspective.
Well, thanks for that, Wendy. And yes, there are a lot of recommendations we could go through, but I think I appreciate you pulling out those. And you know, as you said in our last panel, there was a very passionate conversation about people and why we need to have an all-of-nation effort to engage everyone. And yes, for national challenges. And Steve, I'd love to turn to you. I know you have a big day I thank you for being with us. You've got several things happening with Aerospace Corporation. Love to hear a little bit about that. But I guess, Steve, what I'd really love to hear about you is you think about these incredible missions that you're undertaking at Aerospace with, yourself, your partners. What are you doing to continually innovate anew? I have a feeling it's going to have to do something with people, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think matters most for disruptive technological development and innovation.
Chad, first of all, thanks for inviting me, and I think it's a tremendous report that is being issued. In the title of this session is disruptive innovation. To me, there's been no bigger disruptive event than the pandemic. I think what the pandemic has really taught us is what we can do as a nation to innovate when you get a punch in the face. And my business has been no exception. Aerospace Corporation, we work with all the national security agencies and NASA on America's space program. Before the pandemic, I used to crowd 100 of my top staff into a launch control center where we would work on preparing for launches into space. In the pandemic, we couldn't do that anymore. So overnight, people were doing things that we thought beforehand we couldn't do, which is we reduced by over 70% the number of people that had to be in that control center, and we were using new technologies from which to conduct those operations as safely and reliably as we had before. During this pandemic, we have been undertaking sending astronauts to the space station for the first time on an American commercial launch vehicle. We brought the asteroid scoop. We have a spacecraft on its way to Mars. And we're not alone. We're competing in this innovation. Japan just brought back asteroid samples back, and China just yesterday pulled off an audacious mission to bring back samples from the moon. So what does this mean? To me, to your point, Chad, it's about our workforce. It's really sort of taught me that we need to move from the mindset of brick and mortar to one of a more distributed workforce, and the potential to use the kinds of technologies that were mentioned up front, like 5G. Suddenly, I don't have to worry about having all my staff co-located in the high-cost area of Los Angeles. Suddenly, they could be almost anywhere in the country to do a lot of the work that we do. With this, I think this opens up a lot of potential innovations. I think we're seeing in potentially the reinvention of education. I mean, for example, do students have to be on the campus all 4 years? What if students spent 2 years abroad in industry doing online learning for 2 of the years while they're working, getting hands-on experience, and then maybe 2 years on campus? Same thing for my employees. I think it's really important to have lifelong learning among my top subject matter experts. Why can't they continue online through this university network? I think it also, having a distributed workforce, it really hits on this whole issue of diversity and inclusion. I think you now have an opportunity to reach out to people in rural areas, of different folks of color, underrepresented groups, in a way that we haven't really thought about before. So I do think we're in an incredibly innovative age, and I think this network effect that was referred to earlier really opens up the potential of what is possible that only a few months ago seemed impossible.
Well, Steve, I'm really struck by your remarks, in particular, this idea that through greater diversity and inclusion, we can actually achieve things we did not think were possible. And so I'd love to hear from, and Tom, I'm going to come to you next because I want to hear your thoughts from the perspective of the National Lab. But I'd like to, in addition to seeding this idea about regional innovation, I want to seed the idea with the rest of the panel around the opportunities in the future. Where do you see real change coming from, technology-driven, innovation-based? But Tom, over to you. I'd love to hear your perspective from Los Alamos, what this year has been like. Has it changed your mind on the things the United States needs to do to be the developer and the deployer of innovation for the world? Any recommendations, thoughts?
Well, I guess a couple observations. First off, I think it's instructive, actually, the title of this session, Building the Infrastructure to Develop and Deploy, because it really implies a broadening of the view of what is infrastructure. You know, when you say that word, people think about roads or maybe more recently networks. But if you listen to the discussion we've just been having, we've been talking about people, with expertise to develop those new ideas. Obviously, at the national labs, our role is on the, the front end of innovation in terms of priming the pump with new ideas. And research infrastructure is part of what we do. And I'd like to illustrate how we use that by talking a bit about how we've responded to COVID, not operationally with teleworking and masks. Yes, we've been doing all that, but in terms of taking on the scientific challenge of COVID, relying on infrastructure investments that have been made, over recent years. So our X-ray and neutron sources have been used to study the structure of proteins and the virus itself. That's important in developing an understanding of how to confront it. Very quickly, there was something called the COVID-19 High Performance Computing Consortium that was stood up, involving not only national labs, but industry, companies like IBM, AMD, Hewlett-Packard, academic institutions, MIT, University of Illinois, University of California, other federal agencies like the National Science Foundation, and international partners from Switzerland, from Sweden, from Japan, to apply this infrastructure, the high-performance computing systems that have been built over the years, to modeling the pandemic, trying to understand its progression, and also modeling therapeutics and interventions. And all of this was possible because of those infrastructure investments of years past. And at the national labs, we're actually in about year 15 of a 20-year infrastructure plan, a roadmap that was developed by the Office of Science. And we are starting now to build the last facilities in that 20-year roadmap. It really begs the question of what's next. What investments do we need to be planning for so that 10, 15, 20 years from now, when we face a challenge, whatever kind of global, national challenge it may be, we have the tools and the people in order to tackle that challenge. And so I think that's an important discussion that it's timely to have. The other point that I'd like to make is I mentioned, in this HPC consortium that it wasn't just US institutions or Sweden, Switzerland, Japan, and so forth. The Council on Competitiveness, the name has this word in it, competitiveness, which implies you're competing with someone. And what does that mean in the 21st century in the innovation space? I mean, obviously, we want the US to be competitive economically. We want it to be secure. On the other hand, there are challenges that emerge, like COVID, where we need to reach out to partners like the Swiss or the Swedes or the Japanese. And of course, recently, there's been a lot of concern about the fact that some of those interactions haven't turned out quite the way we might have hoped. There are other players around the world who operate, in different rule sets. There's been a lot of discussion in academia and research labs about how do we protect our assets but still engage in that kind of international exchange of ideas that benefits everyone. I think one of the challenges that we need to be thinking about is, while it's important that we protect what we have, maybe lose a little bit less in some of those exchanges, I think it's more important to think about how do we win more from international partnerships? How do we engage with those who share our values to get the value of bringing more eyes to a problem, more hands to solve a problem, and actually more shared infrastructure to solve a problem? And, that's more challenging than it was in decades past because the US no longer is the larger economy than everyone else. We are no longer a larger research enterprise than everyone else put together. We're going to have to partner, but we have to do it with a view that there is this competitive aspect in the background. We have to make sure that we get our fair share out of those partnerships. And that's much more complex than it was in the last century.
Well, Tom, this idea of how do we win more, and I think we share that. We need to find a way to optimize this abundance, because I think what innovation does is unleashes opportunity, and I think what our report tries to capture is how do we do that better. And one of the ways that Competing in the Next Economy suggests the United States could do a better job of this is to in fact elevate innovation more, bring it to the attention of the incoming president, vice president of the administration, and we actually call for a cabinet level innovation advisory council with the idea that perhaps we need to do a better job in the federal level, but also in our states, of systems integrating at the highest levels, in ensuring that, yes, we're investing, to your point, what infrastructure comes next for the next 20 years. Well, not just the investment there, but what sort of regulatory environment is needed to support that infrastructure. So I'd love to actually hear from all of you, anyone who wants to just chime in, your thoughts on that. Do we need this sort of new attention in our federal government around the opportunities for investment? Any thoughts?
Hey, Chad, maybe I can pull together a couple of thoughts here, because I think there's so many incredible concepts shared here in the last 20 minutes about how do we think about diversity and inclusion and the expectation of opening up capability for everyone to compete. I actually think tech in so many ways can be the great equalizer, because whether you're in Wyoming or whether you're in New York City, you should have access to tech. I think, I think about Verizon in 2020, we actually increased our capital investment and committed spend in 2020 to grow faster in 5G, because we recognize the demand of how we get there. And I actually think competition is really creating an environment for us to go faster, but to do that through partnerships. So whether it's the partnerships that we've established with mobile edge compute with AWS or with Azure to open it up to public development, I think so important. I also think about kind of 5G future form that we've created for interoperability around the world. Tom, you talked about, we can't just look inside the US, we have to look outside of the US. And then this concept of we are all going to be students for life. How do we learn today and then continue to learn in the future? And that's an area where Verizon has put a lot of focus on, both our innovative learning program, where we've deployed technology and curriculum into schools K through 12, to really start at that K through 12 level and say every kid deserves a great education with tech at the core of that. Since 2012, we've invested over $500 million, 325,000 students that have participated, but we've also said that's not enough, because part of what we're dealing with is in this new kind of tech economy is how do you re-educate? And so when you think about the responsibility, we've actually made a commitment to have 500,000 people retrained as you go into 2030 to make sure they have the right skills to compete. Because if we don't do that, some of these rural communities, and I grew up in a rural community in a farming community, and if we don't help people redefine success, whether it's the work that Jamie and the team are doing at John Deere and using tech to drive ag, people are going to miss out. So just think there's so many common themes here. How do we accelerate competition? How do we partner? How do we make sure we work outside of the US? And then how do we recognize we will be students for life? And that tech can be a great equalizer for how we all compete.
Thank you, Tammy. Anyone want to chime in? But Ed, did I see your hand raised?
I'd like to chime in a little bit on this. So I think we have an interesting opportunity, especially given that we're soon, I hope, to be in the post-COVID era, where many economies have been devastated, and yet science has shown that it can provide an incredible boost to not only to the economy, but just to the life in general, because it's provided solutions to a big crisis. So it's a perfect opportunity to harness that and to think about economic stimulus activities that come from the federal level in collaboration with states, but are done in a way that are aimed at generating new economy around innovation. And I think the states with this report also would be willing to step up to that. So second thing I wanted to say was that some of the opportunities around what the economies are, I think a lot of it is technology injection into traditional economies. So for example, in Wyoming, we're really looking at how blockchain can apply to agriculture to make supply chains way more efficient and profitable than before. So that's one area. And then the other is how do we create the new economy as well? And that involves hubs of innovation and so on, where people are actually trained and then supported to create new businesses.
Ed, I want to follow up on that, and maybe we can come to this point that I had pinned earlier. You raised it, Jamie alluded to it, others have mentioned it. It's this idea of regional innovation and perhaps rededicating U.S. attention to growing innovation clusters, hotspots. This has long been a part of the Council on Competitiveness DNA, back since we pioneered some of this work back in the 90s with Michael Porter at Harvard. I'd love to hear from some of you, each of you, on what you think would be areas where there's some opportunity. Jamie, maybe I could turn to you. I know you and I have had some conversations around thinking differently around artificial intelligence and perhaps creating new regional hubs of innovation. We already know, both in the past administration and the incoming administration, a great attention will be placed on AI, machine learning, but would love to hear your thoughts and also anyone else to chime in.
Chad, thanks for the question. You mentioned some statistics to open this discussion up, and it reminded me of the importance of this day specifically in the history of innovation in this country. It was 117 years ago that Orville and Wilbur Wright took to the skies and really changed forever the course of history. And I think that's emblematic of the innovative potential within the country. And if you think of all of the knock-on effects from that one sort of singular event, many of us here today participate in industries that are a consequence of that in no small part. But none of it would have happened, the current state wouldn't have happened without the integration of industry, government, and academia. And I think there's magic to be made when you combine those three together. I think it blends pure and applied research together. I think when you think of this idea of regional centers of excellence in a particular area, and in my view, artificial intelligence is of supreme importance. I think it has the potential to change the world in much the same way as flight did 117 years ago. But I think that the power in these regional focused centers of excellence comes with creating an environment of diversity. You don't just have East Coast, West Coast, you also have Midwest and Mountain West, and you've got diversity in applications, diversity in thought. With that diversity comes increasing power, right, to collaborate and to drive new ideas and new innovation as a consequence of that. I think the connection to industry is important because increasingly that brings about the ability to scale new ideas and new technologies to benefit society at large. But I don't think we can lose sight of the opportunity to also connect those regional organizations, right? They need to represent one organism, if you want to think about it biologically in the end, because they can benefit one to the other, and they can sort of divide and conquer on some of these really tough challenges that we face. But I think there's tremendous opportunity in a model like that for many of these areas of technology moving forward.
Steve and then Tom, please.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I do see there's great value in regional, but I think that Orville and Wilbur Wright taught us one thing is they were not the team that people thought was going to do first flight. In fact, there was a whole different team that the government bet on and thought that was going to do flight first. I think that lesson has taught over and over again is innovation comes in places you never expect. So I think as we think about regional, I think it's really important for us to think nationally, because in fact, I think from my earlier point, as we get better at networking together, I think it gives everybody an opportunity to innovate no matter where you are.
Great point, Steve. Tom, please, and then Wendy.
Yeah, I was just going to observe, there's been much discussion really engendered by the observation that if you look at the economic benefits associated with technology innovation, it has been concentrated in, I think it's 20 to 25 counties that have seen the bulk of that economic benefit. And from my point of view, that really has two aspects as we think about a response. One, of course, is that means there's a whole lot of places that haven't seen that benefit, and that can be a driver for social dislocation and some of the, I think, social challenges that we've seen revealed over the course of the last couple of years. And so obviously that's something that we need to address as a society. But the other aspect is that, that means that there is untapped potential. And if we're just relying on the innovation potential of a small number of very powerful communities, I mean, Steve mentioned, cost of living in LA. I mean, there's things that are ultimately going to tap that potential just based on, the density of people, the availability of people, the cost. And so if we can more broadly tap into the innovation potential of the country, then I think that lifts the cap on what we can accomplish. And given the challenges we face, we're going to need that. And certainly, sitting where I am in northern New Mexico, we've got this great lab that's at the cutting edge of research, surrounded by some of the poorest counties in the country. And I think we need to do better at translating the results of our innovation into impacts, in some of these regions that haven't participated in, some of the economic miracles that we've seen over the course of the last few decades.
Wendy, please.
Just real quickly, when Steve said it's a national view, all I could say is really it's a national view for every individual, right? And providing the opportunity and the education for every individual that sees that they might be a part of this. I think that's key. So it goes back to education in K through 12, to do something different, to infuse innovation and entrepreneurship into our curriculum, to really do what Louis Pasteur said when his famous quote, "Chance favors the prepared mind." And so I think it goes back to the individual and giving those individuals across the broad diversity of this great country the opportunity to participate.
Wendy, thank you. We've got 1 minute left. There's a burning question, and I don't know if all of you will be able to weigh in on it, but when we talk about national and regional, I think we also need to think about how do we engage small business and startups with our large universities, our big companies, and this bridging this valley of death. And I think one of the lessons I'm learning from you all here today is that whether it's a national or regional focus, prototyping, creating these test beds in parts of the country, that's one way that we can begin to bring together smaller startup firms connected with our national labs, our universities, our larger companies, and that's something for sure our Competing in the Next Economy report brings out. Is there any last thought or the panel? I'll thank you all for participating, but if anyone has a burning issue they'd like to put out before we close down, we'd love to hear it.
Chad, maybe not a burning issue, but something I think is so important as we wrap up 2020 and people are tired and anxious about what the future holds. I think this conversation can yield hope for so many that don't have it. And small businesses in particular, I think we've got to really lean in. It's one of the areas we put a lot of focus to say by 2030, we will have 1 million small businesses that can thrive in the digital economy because of the efforts we put in. And I think we've got to make those kind of bold commitments so that everyone can have hope that there is a future that they can participate in 2021 and beyond.
Tammy, Tom, Ed, Steve, Wendy, Jamie, thank you very much. Best to all of you for this holiday season in 2021, and thank you from the Council on Competitiveness for your support.